In this video, I want to talk about NuGet, which is the package manager for .NET, which means that when we're creating our .NET projects, whether that's .NET Core or .NET Framework, we can use this package manager to bring in other people's code that they have packaged up for public use. So in general, a package manager is a thing that allows you to share version code with other folks. That could be publicly with the rest of the world, like we're going to use two public open source packages today. But that can also be when you're working in a company, you can make your own packages that build up your software that you're building and share them only within your company in a version controlled way. And it's just, in the real world, it is rare to be working on a project that is completely composed of code that you wrote. The stuff that we're doing in class in Intro to Programming is the exception, where you're writing most of the code, if not all of the code. But when you get out into the real world, if you're building a game, it's rare that you're going to just like open up your editor and start building from scratch. You're probably going to be using an audio engine that someone else wrote, and a physics engine that someone else wrote, maybe a database adapter that someone else wrote. And that's an important skill to actually learn, is how to work with other people's code. So we're going to use the NuGet package manager. When you go to NuGet.org, you can search for things, and we're going to use two today. One is Figgle, which allows you to, if we check out the project site here, which is just a GitHub page. So the source code for the for Figgle is online here, and we could actually look through it. But if we scroll down the README, here's the documentation for it. It looks like you can just render what we've been doing previously is going to a website to render ASCII banners. Now you can just like render by saying figglefonts.standard.render hello world, and that prints out this to the console. So now you could dynamically generate any banner text you wanted inside of your game. The other one we're going to use is Pastel, which if we go to the project site, check it out. It's also a GitHub page, source code. We could look in and peek into the C# that makes up the Pastel library. But if we just look through here, what it's allowing us to do is take strings and format them any color we want. So instead of how when we've been saying foreground color equals console color dot something, where we've only been allowed to use the colors that Microsoft has provided, the Pastel library will allow us to use any color that we want, and we're able to specify it in terms of RGB or hex. And so we'll dig into this momentarily. Before we get into it, though, let's go back to NuGet.org. A couple words of warning. So with NuGet, this may not work on everyone's machines in the same way, because some of you are going to be on .NET Core if you're on a Mac. Some of you may be on .NET Framework if you're on a Windows machine. And you may be on different versions of those frameworks. So consider all the stuff that I'm showing you like kind of extra polished things that if you get the basics of your game working, then dig into these and bring them into your game. And the other thing that I'll point out here is there are more resources to check out. So if you're having trouble, go to the Learn page. And for Windows, you will end up at this quick start guide that shows you how to install a package on Windows. And if you're on a Mac, I'm going to be demoing on a Windows machine. Look through this article to see what the equivalent commands and interface would look like on a Mac. So let's get into it. I've got a project set up already here, which this is a .NET Core project with almost nothing in it. I have a Pastel demo class that has imported the system.console namespace and prints out Pastel in a header. And I have a Figgle class that's the same thing. It has a public static void run method. I've brought in the system.console. It prints out a Figgle header. So then what I can do is flip back to program. We can get rid of this. Let's bring in using static system.console. We're going to run the Pastel demo, and actually we'll do the Figgle demo first. So quick review, because these methods are static, that means that I don't need to instantiate this class to run it. And for this demo where we only have one method for each of these classes, it's fine that we're using static methods here. So Figgle demo.run, don't need to instantiate it, just need to say the class name, then .run, and then we could write line, press any key to exit, read key true, and this should print out a header for Figgle, a header for Pastel, press any key to exit, and now we could actually start installing those packages and then working with them. Actually, one more thing before we do that. Let's, because we're going to display some banner text that is pretty large, let's make sure that we make our console width pretty big. So window width equals largest window width, and we'll do the same thing for window height and largest window height. So this is going to give us a full screen console to fit the ASCII banners. And we saw in the ASCII art video that there are other ways that we could do this, but this will just be a quick way to get us a window that's big enough to fit anything that we're going to put into it. So we got a nice giant window here. So let's close this and let's actually fill out the Figgle demo. So Figgle is I'll call it the easier of the two packages that I want to show you, but both involve the same workflow for us to get started. We're going to go Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. So this is going to pop open a window that allows us to look through installed packages, or we can browse and search for packages from NuGet.org, which here's our package source over here, NuGet.org. So remember, we have to be connected to the internet to access this. So I'm going to search for Figgle, hit enter, and there's only one option that's popping up. I'm going to look over here, and this is going to show me all of the solutions in my project. Right now we only have one, and for all of the Intro to Programming projects, we're only really going to have one solution in the project. So we can just check here, and then this dropdown allows us to choose which version we're going to install, and we'll default to the latest, which is fine. So we'll install version 0.3. It's going to ask us if we're okay with installing it, and it's telling us all the things that this library, Figgle, needs along with it. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to accept the license. And when it finishes, we have Figgle installed in our project. And so we can start looking at the documentation to figure out how we want to use Figgle and then bring it into our code. So let's go back to the browser. And I still have the Figgle page open. So if you are looking for it, go to NuGet.org, search for Figgle, open up the Figgle package, and then over on the right-hand side, go to project website. And if there's a GitHub page for the Figgle library that you're using, there will often be documentation on the main page in a readme.markdown.md for markdown file. And you've learned how to read documentation produced by Microsoft by looking at the Microsoft documentation. Now we're going to have to flex those same documentation reading muscles, but for documentation that's potentially written by just one person who made the library. And so this is actually a really simple library and shows us that if we call from Figgle fonts any of the font names and then the render method, we pass it the string that we want, and it gives us back a string that we can then print out in like console.writeLine. So it's showing us that this is what it produces, that the library has 250 fonts from the Figlet database, and shows us a couple of examples. So instead of saying figglefonts.standard.render, you could say figglefonts.graffiti.render. So you're going to have to put a little bit of mental effort here into actually reading the documentation. But let's go back to our project and go into our Figgle demo file. And if we just start, let's do it in here. So if we say Figgle dot, we can start to see some of the stuff that's in the Figgle library. And so we saw that it was Figgle fonts dot standard dot render, and then pass in a string, and this gives us back a string that then we could say right line hello world. So let's see if this works. Nice, we've got our banner text showing up. So we've basically just already figured out all of the functionality that comes from Figgle. A couple of things that we can do to make this simpler is up here at the top, we could say using Figgle to mean that anywhere where we're using something that's inside of Figgle, like Figgle fonts, we could drop this prefix. We don't have to use the fully qualified path, so we can say Figgle fonts hello world, and let's break this out on 2 lines so that's a little bit easier to read. Let's say this is ASCII hello. So when we call render, we get a string back, and then we can write line ASCII hello. So that's the standard font. Let's actually see, let's do like a spooky font. So we're going to say Figgle fonts dot, and then here are all of the fonts that the package comes with. And you can go back to the documentation, click on the fonts tab, and go to the, let's see, overview, and this has all of the fonts associated with it, so you can look at an example of each of them. I want to use the Ghost font, so I can tell that the font is called Ghost, which means that if I go back to Figgle fonts and look at the autocompletes and start typing Ghost, we'll see, there we go. Here's the Ghost font. We can say, let's render maybe something like enter if you dare, and then right line ASCII spooky. Run it, and we should see 2 banners print out. So you can use the same approach to like render the name of each scene in your game or the name of each room dynamically, which is an improvement on what the flow has been before. Anytime we needed text that was rendered in a font, we had to go to the browser, render it, and bring it back. But now we actually have some C# code in our project that can render these on the fly, which is pretty cool. Let's work on Pastel now. So we're going to do the same process that we did before. Tools, NuGet Package Manager, manage NuGet packages. We will search for Pastel, click this one that has this icon next to it. We will select that we want to install it into our solution. We would choose the version down here. The latest version is fine to choose. Hit install. Okay. And we should have now Pastel and NuGet installed, and if you Pastel and Figgle installed, and if you click the drop down for dependencies and look under packages, you can see both of the packages that we have installed into this project. So let's flip back to the browser and check out the documentation. So I still have Pastel pulled open here, and right off the bat we can see that the style that Pastel has for their documentation is completely different from Figgle, where Figgle is very terse, not a lot of text. Pastel is a little bit more expository, explaining why the library exists. They're written by 2 different authors. Everyone's going to have their own style of writing documentation, and we have to do our best to try and read it and figure out how to use the library. So starting at the top, it's telling us that the way that it achieves color is by taking a string and wrapping it in a series of codes that tell the terminal what color to render that string in. And it's been tested on Windows and Linux, so fingers crossed folks that are on a Mac that this works, but the author is making no guarantee that the code that's written works on a Mac. There's a little bit of an explanation of they felt limited by the System.Console class, and then there's a how-to, and the how-to is explaining that when we have a string, this library is installing what are called extension methods, so it adds a few methods to all strings in our C# project, so that we can say enter the string dot pastel and pass in a color, and what it's going to do is take the string enter and wrap it in those codes that instruct the terminal to render it in the right color. So we can see here that, you know, if you run that, you get this like blue, light blue enter printing out to the console. And it's also telling us here that we can either use the system.drawing.color object, which is what's being used here, or a hexadecimal string value. So if you haven't seen hexadecimal before, it is a hash followed by 6 characters usually for red, green, blue, and the characters go from 0 to 9, and then A through F. So that's what hexadecimal is. We'll talk a little bit more when we get into the code. The last thing that we should check out is if we keep scrolling down, we can see that this line of code, we have a string, colorize me. We can call .pastel and pass in a color. And then we can call .pastel background on that to format the background. That's giving us an example of all the different things that we can create. So let's flip back to Visual Studio and give it a shot. To speed things up, I'm going to bring in a comment that I've written ahead of time just so that we have this for reference later, explaining that Pastel adds a pastel and pastel background to the string class when we use Pastel. And to simplify things, let's also bring in using Pastel to bring in everything in the Pastel namespace, and let's also use system.drawing.color. So here is that color class that the documentation was telling us that we can use. I'm just bringing it in under the name color so that we can just say color instead of system.drawing.color. So let's start with using hexadecimal colors. And I'll say that looks like this, hashtag followed by 2 characters for red, 2 characters for green, 2 characters for blue. So we can let's create a colorful message. We'll call it rainbow message. Oh my God, double rainbow. And we are going to create a colorful version of it, colorful rainbow message. And this is where we're going to use what we learned from the documentation, where all strings now have this pastel method attached to them, where we can pass in a color and have that color render for us in the terminal when we print it out. So I love to use this tool called HSL Picker, which is at hslpicker.com, which allows you to pick a color, adjust the hue, which is this first slider, the saturation, the lightness, and the alpha for that color. For our purposes, let's leave the alpha at 1, and then maybe we'll grab like a magenta color, and we can go for something like this. And then at the bottom, you can see that it gives us the RGB numbers, and it also gives us the hex. So all I have to do is copy this, bring it back into the project, and paste it in here to format this rainbow message using that color. And then right line, colorful rainbow message. And if we give it a shot and run it, we should hopefully see some colorful text print out. There we go. Oh my God, double rainbow. It seems like it's working. As a way of explaining this, let's drop a breakpoint in here and look at the debugger to see. Here's our rainbow message. It's a string that says, oh my God, double rainbow, and then colorful rainbow message. We can see that this string actually has a whole bunch of characters inserted into it that define the color. And those are the codes that the library was telling us it injects into a string. So we can leave this, get rid of this breakpoint. We can also do this in one line. So, or in one line, we can do right line dot pastel and pass in our color here. So I was breaking it out into multiple lines just so that you could see the flow of what the library is actually doing, but you don't have to do that. You can just inject it in these codes directly in line right before you print. And we should see the same thing happen in both cases. Great, it's working. We also saw that the library allows you to use system.drawing.color to specify things. So one of the disadvantages of this hexadecimal is if we wanted to control the color programmatically, like create a gradient that went from black to red, that'd be really hard to do. We'd have to construct a string, but it's a little bit easier if we use system.drawing.color. So I'm going to throw in a comment here using system.drawing.color, which allows us to pass in red, green, blue. So I'm going to break this out on a couple of lines. We'll create some text that is, let's say, green with a white background. Actually, we'll use the same message that we used before. So what we're going to do is create a foreground color and set that equal to color.from argb. So color again is system.drawing.color, and this is a method that returns to us a color based on what we pass in. And if we look through the autocomplete IntelliSense suggestions here, this is the one that we want, where we specify an integer that's red, green, or blue, and each of those can be 0 to 255. So if we pass in 0, 0, 0, that is no red, no green, no blue, or black. If we pass in 255, 255, 255, that's all red, all green, all blue, which would be white. And then, if we just pass in 25500, that would be all red that's possible. So that would be bright red. And we can also use our HSL picker here to pick a color. Maybe we'll go for like a dark green and then copy and paste the RGB values that correspond to that particular color in here. And we're going to create a background color. Do the same process. This time we'll make the background color white. And when we want to create our message, we can do all of this in one line, but I'm going to step it out to make it a little bit easier to see. So we're going to say create message with foreground. And this is going to be our rainbow message up here, dot pastel foreground color. So this line of code is going to create a new string that has the original message, but with codes injected around the string to control the foreground color. And then I could do message with foreground, and it's a long variable name, but we'll deal with it for the moment, and I'll show you how to do this in a faster way. Pastel background, and we are going to pass in the background color. Oh, whoops, actually this is message with foreground. So what we're doing here is taking the variable that we just created that had the codes wrapped around it for foreground color, and we are asking it to be formatted so that it has the codes for pastel background color. And then we have this massive, obnoxious variable name here that we can use to print colorful message, or print message with foreground and background color. Hit play. There we go. So we've got this like dark green text on a white background. And the shorthand for doing this is we can do all of this in one line. So we could say like write line and then take our rainbow message dot pastel and pass in our color and do dot background color and pass in our background color. And this line is equivalent to everything that we've done here. It's just a little bit harder to read and work with. So usually it's helpful to break this out at least a little bit into separate variables. But if you're doing it this way, you can also take control of the spacing yourself. So for instance, maybe you want to do this to help make it clear what's going on. So we can see that all of this is happening inside of WriteLine, and we are calling pastel and then calling pastel background. And this structure in programming languages is called chaining, where we have a method that we're invoking that returns something that we then call another method on. So we've got this, which returns a string, which we can then call pastel background on. So these should be functionally equivalent. We should see the same thing happen twice in our code. There we go. And the advantage of working with color.fromRGB over hex is that then we can actually control these numbers programmatically. So for instance, what if we wanted to create like a gradient? We could take a variable for red and set it equal to 0 and say that this will run as long as red hasn't, will run up until red hits 255, which is the max value. We will go ahead and add 10. And now we can print out a message like right line. This is colorful. And do dot pastel from RGB. We will use our variable here. And we can do a white background. Oh, whoops, this is supposed to be pastel background. So we're using this short syntax here. We are using some of our white space to make it a little bit more legible when we shove it all into a single line. But this should create a bunch of text that says this is colorful, but each time the red value changes slightly. There we go. So we got black text that goes all the way to red. Now you should be primed to know how to use Pastel and Figgle. We use the NuGet manager to install these, so NuGet package manager. Make sure that you are connected to the internet when you're adding these packages to your project. You can always check what's been added to your project over here. But other than that, feel free to integrate these into your adventure game projects, and good luck.